The emergency room had been her world for 3 years. She knew every broken tile, every flickering light, every shift supervisor who looked through her like she wasn't there. She was the quiet one, the slow one, the one they threatened to fire at least twice a month. Then, at 12 minutes past midnight on a Tuesday, two armed Navy SEALs walked through those glass doors, scanned the room full of doctors and senior staff, and stopped when they found her. The smaller woman, in the worn scrub standing near the supply cart. One of them raised his hand in a crisp military salute. "Lieutenant Harmon," he said, "we need you right now." Before the story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind that will keep you up past your bedtime. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The hospital had a smell that never fully left you. Antiseptic and old coffee and something underneath, both of those things that nobody ever named out loud. But everyone recognized the particular staleness of a building where people arrived frightened and left changed. Callaway Regional Medical Center sat at the edge of Denton Falls, Oregon, a mid-sized city that had never fully decided whether it wanted to be a suburb or a real town. The hospital was not prestigious. It was not the kind of place that attracted ambitious doctors or cutting-edge equipment. It was the kind of place that ran on tired people doing difficult work for modest pay, and it had the carpet stains and outdated monitors to prove it. Nora Harmon had worked the overnight shift in the emergency department for 3 years, 2 months, and somewhere around 16 days, though she had long since stopped counting. She was 34 years old, white, unremarkable in appearance in the way that people become unremarkable when they choose to be hair pulled back without effort, no jewelry, scrubs that fit well enough, and nothing more. She moved through the department with the kind of efficiency that looked, to the untrained eye, like slowness. She didn't rush. She didn't announce herself. She simply arrived at the place where she was needed and did what needed doing. Most of her coworkers had decided within the first month that she was not worth knowing. Not unfriendly exactly, but sealed, private to the point of being strange. She deflected personal questions the way water deflects off glass, not aggressively, just completely. Nobody knew where she was from. Nobody knew if she had family. The break room stories that circulated about Nora Harmon were short and uninteresting. She worked hard. She kept to herself. She occasionally ate lunch alone in the stairwell. That was the whole file. Her immediate supervisor was Deborah Vance. Deborah had been charge nurse at Callaway Regional for 11 years, and she wore those years the way some people wear a grudge, visibly, constantly, and with a specific edge directed at anyone she suspected might outrank her someday. She was not a bad nurse by technical measure. She was thorough, she followed protocol, and she managed the shift schedules with the precision of someone who had done it so long it had become personal identity rather than job function. But she had a particular kind of cruelty that lived underneath the professionalism, not explosive, not dramatic, just steady, kind that chips away instead of breaks. For 3 years, Deborah had made Nora her project. Began small. A comment here about response time. A note in the log about a patient interaction that hadn't gone the way Deborah liked. Then a formal written warning, the first of 2, for what Deborah described as failure to communicate effectively with the clinical team, which in practice meant Nora had disagreed with a treatment call and said so. Then more documentation, more logs. A pattern built slowly, carefully, like a case being constructed by someone who understood exactly how institutional machinery worked and how to use it. Nora absorbed it all with the same sealed expression she brought to everything else. She did not complain. She did not go to HR. She did not look for allies or build coalitions or do any of the things that people in difficult workplace situations are generally told to do. She showed up, she worked, she went home. Whatever she thought about Deborah Vance, she kept it behind a wall that nobody had yet found a door in. The night it all unraveled started like every other overnight shift badly. Nora arrived at 11:45 to relieve the evening team and found the department already stretched thin. 2 trauma bays were occupied. There was a pediatric respiratory case in room 6 that wasn't resolving the way it should, and the waiting area had the particular restless energy of a space that had been too full for too long. Clocked in, pulled the handoff notes, and immediately flagged the respiratory case to the on-call physician. "He's been on the treatment protocol for 90 minutes. she said to Dr. Fowler, who was young, competent, and visibly exhausted. Response is incomplete. I want to recheck his peak flow. He's improving, Fowler said, without looking up from his tablet. He's less symptomatic. That's not the same thing. Fowler did look up then, with the brief, irritated expression of someone who has been doing well enough and doesn't appreciate the suggestion that well enough might not be enough. Check on him at 1. Nora said nothing more. She went to room 6, assessed the child herself, 6 years old. Oxygen saturation holding, but not comfortably. Accessory muscle use still visible. If you knew to look, and quietly adjusted his positioning and added a note to his chart that was so precisely worded it could not be ignored by any physician who bothered to read it. Then she moved on. This was how she worked. Not confrontational, not passive. Something in between that most people found unsettling, without being able to say exactly why. By 12:15, the department had processed 2 discharges. Pediatric case had been upgraded to observation. Fowler had read the chart note, and Nora was managing a 63-year-old man who had come in with what he described as bad heartburn and what his EKG was, quietly suggesting might be something considerably worse. His name was Gerald Okafor, and he was the kind of patient who apologized for taking up space. He sat on the exam table in his jacket and said repeatedly that he was probably fine. He didn't want to be a bother. His wife had made him come, and she was probably overreacting. Your wife has good instincts, Nora said, attaching the leads with practiced efficiency. What time did the discomfort start? Maybe 8? 8:30. I thought it was the chili we had for dinner. Does it radiate anywhere? Arm? Jaw? Back? He paused. A little bit to my left arm. But I figured it's helpful. Thank you. She marked the time and called for a stat troponin without raising her voice or changing her pace. Fowler appeared in the doorway a moment later, and Nora handed him the preliminary strip without comment. He looked at it. Something in his posture shifted. Start the protocol, he said. Already requested, she said. Gerald looked between them with the anxious eyes of a man, beginning to understand that his wife had been right. Is it my heart? We're going to take very good care of you, Mr. Okafor, Nora said, and the way she said it, direct, quiet, not falsely cheerful, seemed to settle something in him. His shoulders dropped. He nodded. She stayed with him through the next 40 minutes, managing the protocol, watching the numbers, fielding his questions with the specific kind of honesty that scared patients usually need more than reassurance. Not brutal honesty, calibrated honesty, the kind that says, I see you clearly, and I am not going to lie to you, and you are in capable hands. It was close to 1 in the morning when Deborah Vance arrived at the nursing station with the express she reserved for moments she had been waiting for. Nora, I need to see you. Nora finished the notation she was entering. Then she turned. 1 minute now. The break room was small and smelled like burned coffee. Deborah closed the door, which was never a good sign. She had a folder, an actual physical folder, which meant this had been prepared in advance. I've been reviewing the shift logs from last week, Deborah said. Specifically the Alcott discharge. Nora waited. You flagged that patient for extended observation. Tending overruled you. Patient was discharged. Deborah opened the folder. Came back 18 hours later with a secondary complication. Yes. You're not supposed to be celebrating that, Nora. You're supposed to be reflecting on why your flag created unnecessary delay and anxiety for a patient who ultimately did fine. Something moved across Nora's face, not quite disbelief, not quite anger. Something quieter and more controlled than either. Came back with a complication. A minor one. Managed outpatient. Flagged him because the presentation was incomplete. Complication validated that. The attending cleared him, Deborah said, her voice taking on the particular precision of someone reciting a prepared argument. You disagreed. You created friction in the clinical team. And this is the 3rd time in 6 months that I have documentation of you undermining physician authority. I wasn't undermining authority. I was advocating for a patient. That is not your call to make. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Nora had been in rooms like this before. Not this exact room, not with this exact woman, but in the particular geography of being told that her read of a situation was wrong when she knew it wasn't. She knew how to wait in that silence. She had been waiting in versions of it for a long time. I'm issuing a formal improvement plan, Deborah said. You'll meet with me weekly. Any further documentation of insubordinate behavior will go to the director. Insubordinate, Nora repeated. Not a question. More like she was checking the word for structural integrity. You heard me, Nora said. Is that all? Deborah hadn't expected that. Expected pushback, or argument, or the small visible cracks that this kind of pressure usually produced. She got none of it. Nora took the folder, looked at it once, set it on the table, and turned toward the door. Nora, she stopped. You've been here 3 years, Deborah said. I've been here 11. I know how this hospital works. I know what happens to nurses who think they're smarter than the people above them. You need to decide what you want your future here to look like. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I want to get back to my patients, and she left. The rest of the shift moved the way bad shifts always move too many things happening at once, with not enough people and equipment that chose the worst possible moment to be temperamental. Cardiac monitor in Bay 3 alarmed twice for reasons that turned out to be wire placement. Patient in the waiting area had a panic attack and needed 30 minutes of de-escalation. Supply cabinet for Bay 1 was missing half of what it was supposed to contain, and Nora spent 12 minutes tracking down the materials she needed through 3 different storage rooms. She did all of it. She didn't complain to anyone. She moved from problem to problem with the methodical focus of someone who has learned to treat chaos as a fixed condition rather than an aberration. At approximately 2:40 in the morning, a new patient came through the ambulance bay. Paramedics were moving fast, which told Nora most of what she needed to know before they said anything. The patient was a man in his late 40s, construction worker, from the look of the calluses on his hands, found unresponsive at a job site with a head injury. GCS of 9 on arrival. Pupils unequal. One side of his face had the particular sunken quality that Nora recognized before she could articulate why she recognized it. She was already moving to the trauma bay when Deborah appeared at the nursing station. Bay 2 is prepared for a head trauma incoming, Nora said. I know, Dr. Alcott is managing it. Nora paused. Alcott is general. This looks like possible epidural hematoma. That assessment is above your station. I'm not diagnosing. I'm flagging for neurology consult. Dr. Alcott will determine if a consult is warranted. The paramedics pushed through the bay doors. Nora watched the patient go past. His breathing had a quality to it, the slight irregularity that meant increased intracranial pressure, and then she looked at Deborah. I want it documented that I recommended an immediate neurology consult. Deborah stared at her. Excuse me? If that's not possible, I'll document it myself. You will not then document it for me. Either way, I need it in the chart. The look on Deborah's face was the look of someone who has just had the thing they were waiting for handed to them, wrapped and addressed, questioning the attending physician's judgment. Again, in front of the transport team, I'm creating a clinical record. You're done for tonight. Deborah's voice had gone flat and final. Badge now. There were 3 paramedics standing there. There were 2 other nurses within earshot. Apartment had not gone quiet. It never went quiet. But there was a particular quality to the nearby attention, the kind of half-listening that people do when they suspect something significant is happening. Nora looked at Deborah for a moment. Then she unclipped her badge, set it in Deborah's outstretched hand, and walked toward the locker room. She didn't run. She didn't look at anyone. She walked the way she always walked, evenly, without excess movement, without anything on her face that she hadn't chosen to put there. She pushed through the door to the back corridor, and the sounds of the department diminished behind her. The locker room was empty. Nora sat down on the bench in front of her locker and stayed very still for a moment. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She had known, somewhere, that this was coming. Deborah had been building toward this for a long time, and Nora had been too tired and too stubborn to give her what she needed to get there faster. Now it was here. She breathed in through her nose, held it for 3 seconds, released it through her mouth. She had learned that particular technique a long time ago in a context that had nothing to do with hospital locker rooms. She was reaching for the combination on her locker when she heard it, a sound above her. Outside above the building, a rhythmic mechanical thunder, low and heavy and growing. She had heard that specific sound enough times in enough different kinds of weather that her body knew what it was before her mind had finished processing it. Helicopters, military by the sound of the rotors, not the lighter, higher pitch of civilian medevac, the deep chop of something much larger, more than one. She sat completely still for 3 seconds. Then she stood. She went to the small frosted window near the top of the locker room wall and stood on the bench to see through it. The hospital roof was lit by landing lights she hadn't seen activated in her 3 years at Callaway Regional, and as she watched, a military transport helicopter settled onto the helipad with a precision that spoke to highly trained pilots, doing something they had done many times before. Behind it, at the edge of the hospital's main parking lot, a second aircraft was landing. Both of them were running dark, except for the minimum required lights. Nora got down from the bench. She had her jacket half on and was moving toward the locker room door when it opened from the other side. 2 men, both in tactical gear, weapons holstered, moving with the particular controlled efficiency of people who had been in much higher stakes situations than a hospital locker room, and were currently running on something that wasn't quite urgency, but was adjacent to it. The first one was broad-shouldered with a jaw that had been broken at least once and healed slightly wrong. The second was leaner, younger, with the eyes of someone who had learned to assess a room faster than most people learn to read. They both stopped when they saw her. The broader one spoke first. Nora Harmon. Not a question. Yes, she said. He came to attention. Crisp, deliberate, the kind of military salute that doesn't happen casually. Lieutenant Harmon. Commander Bates sent us. We have a situation. Nora finished pulling on her jacket. Her hands were still steady. How many casualties? 4 confirmed. 1 critical, declining fast. What's the mechanism? Underwater demolition. Training exercise. Blast overpressure, debris impact. 1 entrapment. We have 2 more we can't stabilize. She nodded once. Give me 90 seconds. She went to her locker, opened it, and pulled out a bag from the bottom shelf. It was not a hospital-issued bag. It was older than her time at Callaway Regional, olive drab canvas, with worn straps and series of along one side that were no longer visible under the layers of careful, methodical packing that had been done and redone many times. She slung it over one shoulder. When she turned around, both men were looking at the bag the way people look at something that answers a question they didn't realize they'd been asking. Let's go, she said. She pushed past them into the corridor, and they fell into step behind her, not leading. Following which was when the shape of the night shifted entirely, because the corridor she stepped into was no longer empty. Deborah Vance was standing at the junction where the back hallway met the main emergency department floor, and she had clearly come to say something further. The formal look, the folder still in her hand, the expression of someone who had been waiting to deliver a final word. Behind her, visible through the department doors, the rest of the overnight team had been drawn toward the entrance by the sound of the helicopters. Dr. Fowler was there. 2 of the ER nurses, the transport paramedics who had just brought in the head trauma case. Deborah looked at the 2 men in tactical gear. Then she looked at Nora. Then she looked at the bag. What is this? She said. I have to go, Nora said, and she kept walking. You've been suspended. You can't. The broader SEAL, the one who had delivered the salute, stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Ma'am, suggest you step aside. I'm the charge nurse of this department, and she has been formally. Lieutenant Harmon is operating under federal authorization. His voice had the particular quality of someone who has given orders in places where orders actually had to land. That supersedes your charge nurse authority, your suspension, and anything else you're about to say. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. Deborah's face went through several things, in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, something that might have been the first edge of confusion about whether she had badly miscalculated something. Nora did not slow down. She did not look back. She passed through the department, and the people there parted for her the way people part when the situation has clarified itself past the point of uncertainty. And she went through the main doors and out into the night air, where the sound of the helicopters was still heavy and present and real. She had worked 3 years at Callaway Regional Medical Center. She had spent 8 years before that in places that had no names on public maps, doing work that didn't appear in any employment record that Deborah Vance could have accessed, treating injuries that most emergency department nurses would never see in a full career. She had treated blast injuries in temperatures that froze equipment. She had improvised surgical support in conditions that had no right to produce survivors. She had made calls under pressure that had cost her sleep for years afterward, and had made her the specific kind of person that a Navy SEAL commander, faced with a crisis and a list of options, had put one name at the top of. She had come to Denton Falls to rest from all of that, to be ordinary, to disappear into the quiet routine of a regular hospital doing regular work, where nobody needed her to be anything more than competent and present and steady. She had almost made it. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, and somewhere above her, the second helicopter's rotors were slowing, and the lean SEAL was already on a radio, relaying her position to someone on the other end. And Nora Harmon was moving, at a pace that was not quite running, but was no longer the measured walk she'd used through the department. Behind her, she heard the emergency room doors slide open, and one of the nurses, she thought, not Deborah, call her name. A single word, rising slightly at the end, more question than call. She didn't turn around. The night was clear. The hospital roof lights cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the military aircraft sat there like a fact that couldn't be argued with. And somewhere inside one of them, there was a man who needed her to be exactly what she had spent 3 years trying not to be. She reached the edge of the parking lot, and the second SEAL moved ahead to signal the aircraft. The rotors began to accelerate. Nora kept walking, her bag on her shoulder, her face forward, and behind her the lights of Callaway Regional Medical Center grew smaller and smaller, and the woman who had just taken her badge was standing somewhere in that building, holding it. And none of it was the thing that mattered right now. The ground crew waved her forward. She ducked under the rotor wash and climbed in. The helicopter smelled like hydraulic fluid and wet neoprene and something metallic that Nora recognized without wanting to. She strapped in without being told where to sit. Crewmen across from her handed her a headset, and she pulled it on as the aircraft lifted, the lights of Dinton Falls tilting and shrinking below until the city became a scatter of yellow points against dark ground. And then the clouds took it, and there was nothing outside the windows but black. The broader SEAL, the one who had given the salute, the one who had told Deborah Vance to step aside, was sitting directly across from her. In the better light of the aircraft interior, she could see his rank insignia. Senior Chief Petty Officer. His name tape read Aldrin. He was watching her with the particular expression of someone who has been given a mission objective, currently reassessing whether the objective is going to hold up. She understood the look. She'd gotten it before. "Brief me," she said, raising her voice over the rotor noise. Aldrin leaned forward. "Training exercise. Classified location. 40 miles northwest. Underwater demolition-controlled breach. Went wrong. We had 4 men in the water when the secondary detonated. 3 recovered. 1 still unaccounted for as of 40 minutes ago. The one still unaccounted for entrapment or drift. Entrapment. He's located. Dive team is working extraction. The issue is he's been under cold water with blast exposure, and we don't know his status. And the 3 recovered?" Aldrin pulled a tablet from the chest rig and handed it across. The screen showed field-recorded vital signs rough numbers, the kind that get logged when you're working in conditions that don't accommodate precision. She looked at each line in sequence without hurrying. "This one," she said, tapping the second entry. "These numbers are wrong. Hold. I mean, they're physiologically inconsistent. Pulse at this rate with this BP and this O2, that's not a stable patient. That's a patient about to decompensate." She handed the tablet back. "How long to the facility?" 11 minutes. She nodded and said nothing else. She looked out the window at the dark and did the things she had learned to do, in the back of vehicles moving toward situations she couldn't yet see. She went through it in her head. Not the emotional preparation, not the psychological stealing, just the clinical inventory. What she knew, what she didn't know, what she would need to find out in the first 60 seconds on the ground, and what would have to wait. The lean SEAL, she hadn't gotten his name yet, was on a radio at the front of the aircraft, relaying something she couldn't fully hear over the rotors. He glanced back at her once. She looked at him steadily, and he looked away first. 8 minutes out, Aldrin said. "Lieutenant, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "The facility team is going to push back. They have their own medical staff. It's going to be a situation. It's already a situation. I mean, they're going to have opinions about authority." She looked at him. "Is Commander Bates going to be there?" "He's already on the ground." "Then it's handled," she said, and looked back at the window. She said it with a flatness that was not arrogance. She wasn't performing certainty she didn't feel. It was simpler than that. She had been in rooms before where authority was contested and the patient was dying and someone had to move past the contest. She knew how to be that person. It was not a skill she was particularly proud of. It was just a skill. The facility materialized out of the dark as they descended a compound that didn't appear on any civilian map. built into a depression in the coastal terrain so that its light slots were swallow the surrounding geography. There was a landing pad, and on the landing pad, there were people waiting, and as the aircraft touched down, Nora was already unstrapping. She was on the ground before the rotors had finished settling. Commander Dale Bates was 51 years old and had the face of a man who had spent those years doing things that didn't photograph well. He met her at the edge of the landing pad, and the first thing he said was not hello and not a briefing update. He said, "Harmon," and the single word carried the specific weight of someone who has been waiting a long time to say it, and not comfortably. "Commander," she said, "you look terrible. 3 years of night shift," she said. "Walk with me." He fell into step beside her. Compound was not large, but it was dense prefab structures arranged around a central operations building. Personnel moving with the controlled urgency of people in the middle of an unresolved problem. She could see the medical bee from the edge of the pad, a building with double-wide doors currently propped open and lit from inside. "Give me the full picture," she said. Bates talked fast. Training exercise had been a controlled underwater demolition standard for the advanced program, something this team had done variants of at least a dozen times. The breach had gone as planned. The secondary detonation had not. Nobody had a clean answer yet for why the secondary went when it did, and that was somebody else's problem for later. What mattered now was 4 men, 3 in the medical bay, and 1 still in the water with a dive team around him that was running out of good options. "The one in the water," Nora said. "What's his name?" "Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb. Age 29. Water temperature 51 degrees. He's been in approximately 52 minutes. She did the math without writing anything down. "What's his situation structurally?" "The entrapment. Debris from the secondary. His left leg is pinned under a collapsed frame section. Divers have been working it, but the frame shifted and they lost access. They've been talking to him. He was responsive up to about 15 minutes ago, then went quiet." "Quiet or unresponsive?" Bates was quiet for a beat. "Unknown." She processed that. 51-degree water. 50-plus minutes. Blast exposure. Pinned. Now unresponsive, or nearly so. She had seen survival cases with worse numbers. She had also seen the other kind. "The 3 in the bay," she said. "Who's managing them?" "Dr. Reese." "He's good." "What kind of good?" Another beat. "Trauma fellowship. 3 years. Good under normal pressure." "But not this," she said. "He's managing." "You said that carefully." Bates didn't answer, which was an answer. They pushed through the double doors, and the medical bay hit her all at once noise. Heat from the equipment, the particular fluorescent quality of light in a space where people are working too fast in too small an area. 3 treatment stations had been improvised along the left wall. 2 were occupied. A third was being set up by a medic who looked young enough that Nora automatically revised her internal assessment of the facility's resources. At the far station, a man in scrubs mid-30s, short, moving with the energy of someone who had too many things to track simultaneously, looked up when she came through the door. This was Reese. She could see immediately what Bates had been diplomatically not saying. Reese was not losing control, but he was close to the ceiling of what he could hold at once. And he knew it, and not knowing who she was or what her function was here, his first response was a flicker of territorial resistance. "I didn't authorize additional medical personnel," he said. "Commander Bates did," she said, pulling the strap of her bag off her shoulder. "Talk to me about the second patient." "I'm managing the second patient." "I can see that. Tell me what you're managing." His jaw tightened. He was not stupid. He could read the room, read the 2 SEALs who had come through the door behind her, read the dynamic, but being able to read something and being comfortable with it are different things. "Petty Officer Delaney," he said tightly. "Blast concussion, bilateral. Probable tympanic rupture." He stopped. Then, slower, possible intracranial involvement. "I've been watching the pupils." Nora was already at the station. Put on gloves her own from the bag and looked at the patient. Delaney was 31 or 32, she estimated. Large-framed, currently doing the specific nothing of someone whose body is managing a serious threat by shutting down the inessentials. Pupils were unequal by a margin she could see without instruments. "When did the asymmetry develop?" she said. "I noticed it 20 minutes ago. It wasn't as pronounced on admission." "What was the GCS on admission?" 13. "It's been drifting." "What is it now?" Reese hesitated. She looked up from the patient and found Reese's eyes. I'm not here to take over your bay. I'm here because you have 4 critical patients and you're 1 physician. Tell me the GCS. He held for 1 more second, then 10, maybe 9. 3 points in 20 minutes. She looked at the IV access Reese had established and noted that it was good he had done that right, and then she looked at the equipment available and revised her plan twice in about 4 seconds. He needs a CT, she said. We don't have CT on site. Then he needs a transfer, and the transfer needs to happen in the next. She checked the clock on the wall. 15 minutes, or the window gets much harder to manage. Who's your nearest facility with neuro? Kessler Naval. 40 minutes by air. She looked at Bates, who was standing just inside the doors. Get the transfer aircraft prepped. Bates looked at Reese. Reese looked at Nora. There was a moment, and she didn't rush it, didn't force it, just let it sit, where the question of who was in charge of this space resolved itself the way those questions always resolve when the patient is declining and somebody has to move. Do it, Reese said, and reached for his radio. The next 40 minutes were the kind that compressed time in both directions, expanding in the moment, shrinking in memory. Nora worked the second station while Reese managed the first, and the young medic kept the third patient stable under intermittent guidance from both of them. Delaney was loaded onto the transfer aircraft at the 14-minute mark, which was not smooth. There was an equipment issue with the loading ramp that cost 90 seconds nobody could afford. But it happened, and it left, and Nora allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to stand still before she turned to the remaining patients. The first patient, Petty Officer Callum Grant, 26, blast injury to the chest wall, and one arm was the most visually dramatic and the most straightforwardly manageable. He had lost real blood, and he was in considerable pain, and he had the dazed, slightly outraged expression of a young man who had just discovered that he was not actually indestructible, which Nora had seen many times, and which she found, privately, more useful than its alternative. People who understood they were hurt were easier to work with than people who were trying to pretend otherwise. Stay with me, Grant, she said, adjusting the drip rate on his IV. I'm with you, he said, slightly slurred. Where'd Delaney go? Transfer. He's going to a facility that can do more for him. They got to him in time. She said it with enough certainty that he accepted it, though the truth was that she didn't know yet, and the not knowing was something she set aside in a small closed room and would deal with later. The third patient was the one that had been worrying her since she looked at the tablet numbers in the helicopter. Petty Officer Theo Marsh, 34, 8 years in, blast overpressure exposure with probable pulmonary involvement, was lying quiet and still in a way that looked like stability and was not. His numbers had been wrong on the tablet, and they were wrong now, and the wrongness had a particular shape to it that she had seen twice before in her career, once in a situation she had managed successfully, and once in a situation she had not, and the memory of the second one lived in a specific corner of her mind that she did not visit unless she absolutely had to. She visited it now because she needed to understand what she was looking at. Reese appeared at her shoulder. He'd gotten the first patient to a point where the medic could monitor, and he was looking at Marsh's chart with the expression of someone who has been circling a problem they haven't named yet. His O2 has been creeping, Reese said. I know. I've increased the supplemental. I know. It's not a ventilation problem. He looked at her. What do you mean? She looked at Marsh's chest wall the way it moved, the subtle asymmetry that had been there since she walked in, less than a centimeter difference in the rise between left and right, but it was there. She put her stethoscope to his chest and listened for 15 seconds, which felt like a long time in a room with this much pressure in it. Pulled the stethoscope back. He has a developing tension pneumothorax. Reese went still. The admission x-ray didn't show. Blast injury. It develops. The original exam was 40 minutes ago. She was already reaching into her bag. I need a needle decompression kit. Tell me you have one on site. Supply cabinet. Left wall. He was moving before he finished the sentence. The medic, whose name she still didn't know, looked at her with the wide, controlled focus of someone who has been well trained and is currently extremely scared. You, she said. What's your name? Corman Alvarez. Alvarez. When I do this, I need you on his arm monitoring pulse. Call out any change. Any change. I don't care how small. Can you do that? Yes, he said, without hesitation, which was the right answer. Reese came back with the kit. He handed it over, and she could see that his hands were not entirely steady, which she noted without judgment. She had been in situations that made steady hands difficult. She understood it. Her own hands were steady. This was not superiority. This was the specific product of having been in enough situations that the fear had been rerouted somewhere else since, not eliminated, just filed under after. Under later, under when there's time for it, which there currently was not. Procedure took 4 minutes. It was not comfortable for anyone present. Marsh surfaced briefly from whatever half-conscious state he'd been in and made a sound that the medic handled by staying exactly where he was and maintaining contact without flinching, which Nora noted and filed. When it was done, they watched the numbers. The O2 crept up, then more than crept. Marsh's breathing changed the particular shift from labored to merely difficult, which in this context was a meaningful improvement. Reese exhaled. It came out shakier than he probably intended. Good call, he said quietly. She didn't respond to that. She was watching the monitor. It was somewhere at the next 20 minutes, while things had achieved a temporary fragile equilibrium in the medical bay, that Bates came back through the double doors with a different quality of urgency to his walk. They got Webb out, he said. Nora alive. Alive. Barely. He held the door. They need you outside. The dive extraction had happened at the far edge of the compound, near a concrete channel that fed to the training water source. By the time Nora reached it, the dive team had Webb on the ground and were working him, 2 of them, hands moving, someone calling out numbers. Compound lights were harsh, and the ground was wet from the water the divers had tracked in, and Nora went to her knees on that wet concrete without hesitating. Marcus Webb was 29 years old. He didn't look it right now. He looked much older in the particular way that severe hypothermia ages a person, the grayness of the skin scent, the strange waxy quality, the absence of the micro-movements that make a face look like a face. Core temperature, as measured by the dive team's equipment, was 31.2 Celsius. His pulse was present but weak and irregular. "What have you given him?" she said to the diver currently managing the airway. "Warm saline IV started 2 minutes ago, no drugs. We were waiting." "Stop the saline. Slow the rate, you're warming too fast. Get me a rectal probe. I need continuous core temp." Put her hands on Webb's chest and felt the quality of the heartbeat, which told her several things, none of which were good, the most pressing being that she had a very narrow margin to work with, and the wrong intervention would close it permanently. Bates crouched beside her. "Tell me, he's in J-wave territory. His heart is irritable, and if we shock it wrong..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "What do you need?" "Warm, humidified oxygen if you have it. Warm IV bags on the groin and axillae, not direct contact. And I need someone to call Kessler and ask about ECMO availability, because if his rhythm breaks down, we're going to need something I cannot do in a field compound." Bates was on the radio before she finished. The diver, young, efficient, visibly shaken by what he'd pulled out of the water, stayed at the airway and did exactly what she told him, without adding anything extra. This was a skill not everyone had, and Nora had stopped being surprised at who turned out to have it. It was often people who had been in enough situations that they'd learned the specific usefulness of silence. Webb's temperature, at the 15-minute mark, had risen to 31.8. 20 minutes, his rhythm steadied, not normalized, not safe, but less immediately volatile. 22 minutes, his eyes opened. They didn't focus. They opened and then closed again, and that was all. But it was enough to change the temperature of the space around him in a way that had nothing to do with the warm packs. 2 of the dive team members, who had been standing at a disciplined distance, each made an involuntary sound that was immediately suppressed. "He's in there," Alvarez said quietly, from somewhere behind her. "He's in there," she confirmed, which was not a promise about the outcome, but was a true statement about the present moment. She stayed on the wet concrete with Marcus Webb for another 40 minutes, adjusting, monitoring, making decisions by increments, the way you make decisions, when the margin is narrow and the cost of error is final. Bates stayed nearby, without hovering. Aldrin brought her a jacket at some point that she put on without looking up. Kessler confirmed ECMO availability. The decision about whether to transfer was balanced on a knife's edge transport risk versus resource availability, and she worked through it without talking it out loud, which was a hat she'd developed when there was nobody around who could usefully participate in the working through. Reese appeared at the edge of the group at one point, and she gave him a status summary in 6 sentences, and he took it and went back to the bay without argument. Something had shifted between them in the past hour. Not warmth exactly. More like the specific respect that develops between people who have been in a difficult situation together and have found each other professionally reliable. She made the call to hold the transfer at the 45-minute mark. Webb's temperature had reached 33.1, and his rhythm, while still not normal, had stabilized enough that the transport risk now exceeded the resource gap. She would rather have him improving in a field compound than potentially declining in a moving aircraft. It was the right call. She didn't know yet whether it would turn out to be right. But it was the right call to make with the information available, which was the only standard she had ever been able to hold herself to. Compound quieted sometime after 3 in the morning. Not empty, there was still activity. Still personnel moving. Still the ongoing management of 3 patients in various states of precarity, but the first violent peak of the crisis had passed, and what remained was the sustained focus of people doing careful work over time. Nora sat on an equipment case outside the medical bay, with her bag between her feet and a paper cup of something that had been described as coffee, and was at best in the same general category. She was not thinking about anything in particular. This was also a skill she'd developed, the ability to let the mind empty between crises, rather than filling the space with anticipation or retrospection. She had learned it the hard way, over years, in conditions that made this compound feel orderly. Aldrin sat down beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Commander Bates said you left the service voluntarily." "I did. Can I ask why?" She looked at the cup. "I was tired." "It's not the whole answer." "No," she said, "but it's the part I give." He nodded as if that satisfied him, which it probably didn't, but he was smart enough to leave it there. They sat in the specific kind of companionable silence that develops between people who have spent a night managing something serious together. Then his radio crackled. She heard the message, not the words. The transmission quality was poor, but the tone of it had a shape she recognized. Aldrin stood up, and his face did something controlled and deliberate. "What?" she said. "They found something." "In the water? The dive site?" "No." He looked at her directly. "At Callaway Regional. One of our investigators has been running a background check on everyone in the medical facility. Tonight's standard protocol when we pull classified personnel into an operation." He paused. "They found something in the hospital's internal documentation logs. Records flagged to your case file." She was very still. "What kind of records?" she said. "Documentation. Medical assessment logs." His voice was carefully even. "Logs that appear to have been altered." He looked at her, repeatedly, and dated back as far as 14 months. The paper cup in her hand was crushed slightly at the rim from her grip, and she hadn't noticed until now. She set it down. 14 months, she said. "That's when the pattern starts." Our investigator pulled the originals from the hospital's backup system. The changes were made to the active files, but the backup copies were overlooked. She was processing this with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to Webb's hypothermia and Marsh's pneumothorax. But something underneath the efficiency was running in a different register entirely, something that was not calm and not professional, and that she was currently keeping in the same closed room as all the other things that didn't have time to be felt yet. "The altered records," she said. "What do they show?" Aldrin sat back down. He put the radio on the case beside him and looked at it instead of at her. "They show a nurse making repeated clinical errors," he said. "Missed flags, bad assessments, decisions that look in the documentation like a pattern of incompetence, and the original records show the opposite." The compound was quiet around them. Somewhere inside the medical bay, she could hear Marsh's monitor beeping in a slow, stable rhythm. "Deborah Vance," Nora said. It wasn't a question. Aldrin didn't answer. He didn't need to. She stood up, and her hand went to the strap of her bag, and she held it there for a moment, not moving, just holding, and looked out at the darkness beyond the compound lights, where the training water was still and dark, and Marcus Webb's survival odds, as of 40 minutes ago, had gone from poor to something she might let herself call possible. Behind her, the medical bay door opened and Reese appeared. "Harmon," he said, "Marsh is asking for you." She turned. She let go of the bag strap. She had known, in a way she'd never said out loud, that Denton Falls had been borrowed time. She had known it the way you know a thing you're trying, not to examine too closely, at the edge of awareness, never in the center. 3 years of nights, in a department where she'd done everything right and watched it get documented as wrong. And she had told herself that it was manageable, that she could outlast it, that eventually the truth had a way of surfacing. She had not expected it to surface like this. She had not expected that the thing dismantling Deborah Vance's carefully constructed version of events would be a military investigation triggered by a classified training accident 40 miles from Denton Falls that had nothing to do with Callaway Regional Medical Center and everything to do with the fact that Nora Harmon had never stopped being exactly who she was, no matter how hard she'd tried to be someone smaller. She walked back into the medical bay. Marsh's eyes were open and tracking, which was a significant improvement over 2 hours ago. He looked at her with the particular unguarded expression of someone who has been very close to a door they didn't want to go through and has come back from the edge of it. "You're the one who did the needle thing," he said. His voice was rough. "I am." He stopped, made a face that was half grimace, half something else. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said, which was what she always said, because she had never found a better way to receive it. She checked his vitals, adjusted the flow on his oxygen line, made a note in the chart. Standard, careful. The things she had been doing her whole career, in this room and in every room before it. Outside, Aldrin was still sitting on the equipment case. She could see him through the medical bay window, radio in hand, talking to someone on the other end. And somewhere in Denton Falls, in a hospital that had her badge and not her presence, something was beginning to unravel that had been coiled tight for 14 months. And it was unraveling, because the woman they'd humiliated and suspended and sent home in the dark had turned out to be exactly the wrong person to underestimate and the right person to call when the situation had no room left for anything less than the truth. The monitor beeped. Marsh breathed. Webb's numbers, on the tablet Alvarez held up from across the bay, showed a temperature of 33.6 and a rhythm that, for the first time all night, looked something close to stable. And, in the backup server of Callaway Regional Medical Center, 40 miles south, 14 months of altered records sat next to the originals that contradicted them, patient, silent, waiting for someone to open the right file. The file sat on Aldrin's tablet for 6 hours before anyone at Callaway Regional knew it existed. That was how long it took the military investigator, a compact, methodical woman named Specialist Dana Pruitt, who worked out of the Naval Criminal Investigative Services Regional Office and had the particular patience of someone who had made a career of finding things people had tried to hide, to pull the complete comparison between the active documentation files and the backup server records. 6 hours, most of which Nora spent either in the medical bay or sitting outside it in the cold, and by the time the full report landed on Bates's desk at the compound, sky to the east had gone from black to the particular gray-blue that precedes dawn without committing to it. Nora was checking Webb's temperature, 34.1, trending right, his pulse more regular than it had been at any point in the night when Bates came through the door and said her name in a way that made her finish what she was doing before she turned around. He had a printed copy. Old habit, she suspected some people in his position still printed the things that mattered, as if the paper made it more real than the screen. He set it in the supply cart, beside her, without handing it over directly, which was a particular kind of respect, letting her choose when to pick it up. She picked it up. The report was 43 pages. She read the executive summary first, then went back and read the evidentiary section in full. She stood at the supply cart in the medical bay, while Webb breathed and Alvarez moved quietly in the background, and she read 14 months of her own professional history, rewritten in someone else's handwriting, and then compared, line by line, to what she had actually written. She had known abstractly what Aldrin told her last night. Knowing abstractly and seeing the documentation in sequence were different experiences. The alterations were not crude. Whoever had done this had understood clinical language well enough to make the changes read naturally. A flag shifted from urgent to noted for monitoring, an assessment of deteriorating softened to stable with observation, a recommendation for immediate specialist consult reworded as attending to determine need. Small changes, each one individually deniable, collectively building a portrait of a nurse who missed things, who assessed carelessly, who needed supervision. 14 months. Approximately 63 individual record entries, all of them traceable to the same access credentials. She set the report back on the cart and stood very still for a moment. Pruitt flagged it to us because of the overlap with the operation, Bates said. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who is not sure what they're going to get and is prepared for several different things. The records involve a cleared service member, you. Puts it in our jurisdiction. And Callaway Regional? She said. Doesn't know yet. Pruitt's coordinating with the Oregon State Medical Board and the hospital's administrative oversight. They'll be notified today. Today. This morning. Within the hour, probably. She turned back to Webb. She adjusted the warm pack placement by approximately 2 centimeters, which did not strictly need adjusting, and Alvarez noticed and said nothing, which she appreciated. There's more, Bates said. She didn't look at him, I gathered. 2 of the patient outcomes that were documented against you, the Alcott discharge that Vance referenced in your file, and a patient from 8 months ago named Garfield, came in with cardiac symptoms. Those patients came back in. Both of them. The complications they came back with align with your original assessments, not with the attending's decision to discharge. He paused. Flags had been acted on. The readmissions likely don't happen. She thought about Gerald Okafor, who had come in the night before with his jacket on and apologized for taking up space. She thought about how he'd accepted the honest answer she gave him because she'd given it without decoration. Was anyone seriously harmed? She said. Garfield had a prolonged hospitalization. Covered. Alcott had a secondary complication outpatient resolved. Another pause. That's not the point, Harmon. I know what the point is. Falsification of medical records. It's not a workplace dispute. This is a crime. She turned then. She looked at him directly, and he met it without flinching, which was one of the things she had always respected about Dale Bates in the years, when respecting things about him had been a regular occurrence. I know, she said. I've known something was wrong for a long time. Why didn't you? Because I didn't have what Pruitt has. She picked up the report again and held it for a moment. I had my word against a charge nurse with 11 years at that hospital and documentation that made me look incompetent. She set it back down. This is what it took. Bates was quiet. She looked back at Webb. Going to make it, she said. Not because Bates had asked, but because the thing needed to be said out loud for her own accounting. Going to make it, and he's going to have hearing loss in one ear, and he'll probably feel that blast in his left knee for the rest of his life. But he's going to be here. Because of you. Because of a lot of people who did their jobs in a hard situation. Including your corpsman, who I'd taken any bay I've ever worked in. She peeled off her gloves. What happens now? Pruitt notifies the hospital, then State Licensing Board. Then it goes to the DA's office for assessment. He picked up the report. And you need to give a formal statement. They'll want it today. When does the aircraft go back? 600 hours. 40 minutes. She nodded. She took her bag from the corner where she'd set it, and she stood for a moment looking at the 3 patients in various states of recovery along the wall, Grant sleeping, his color better than it had been, Marsh awake and watching her with the particular attention of someone who has recently been very close to a door they didn't go through. Webb breathing in the slow, deliberate rhythm of a body working extremely hard to maintain itself. She had made 3 calls tonight that she wasn't certain about at the time she made them. That was the reality of it, not the version where her instincts were infallible and every decision was the right one, but the actual version, where you worked with incomplete information and imperfect tools, and you made the call that was most defensible given what you had, and then you stayed present with the consequences. One of the calls holding Webb instead of transferring, she was more confident about now than she'd been 4 hours ago. One of the calls, the needle decompression on Marsh she'd known, was right in the moment, and the numbers had confirmed it. The third one was the Delaney transfer, and she wouldn't know if that had been right until she had word from Kessler about how he'd arrived and what the CT had shown, and she hadn't had that word yet, and the not knowing was something she was carrying in the place where the other things she was carrying lived. She shouldered her bag. Marsh, she said. He looked at her. You're going to want to move your right arm on the hour, every hour. Don't let them tell you to rest it. You'll lose range of motion. Make them work it. Yes, ma'am, he said. She walked out. The aircraft back to Denton Falls departed at 6:03, which was close enough. The dawn, from altitude, was the specific shade of orange that Nora had seen from the back of moving aircraft, more times than she could easily count. She watched it without feeling nostalgic, because she wasn't the type, and without feeling nothing. Because nobody who had just spent a night like that was capable of feeling nothing, regardless of how well they managed the outward presentation of it. Aldrin was on the aircraft again. He was on his phone for most of the flight, which was fine. She used the time to write her statement notes in the small, Precise handwriting she'd developed for field conditions, compact, legible, factual. Nothing that couldn't be read back in the same form it was written. She filled 6 pages. When the aircraft touched down at the edge of Denton Falls at the regional airport's secondary facility, there was a vehicle waiting with 2 people in it she didn't know. They introduced themselves as investigators from the Oregon State Medical Board's Compliance Division. Professional, they had credentials, and they were very clearly not there to see Aldrin. "Miss Harmon," the taller one said, "we have some questions." "Harmon," Aldrin said, correcting the form of address without making it a thing. The investigator glanced at him. "Lieutenant Harmon, we have some questions." "I have a written statement," she said, and handed them the 6 pages. "I'm also available for whatever follow-up you need. But I have something I need to do first." She took a car back to Denton Falls. Callaway Regional Medical Center in the early morning had a specific quality to it. The overnight staff wrung out and going home. The day staff arriving with their coffee and their performed freshness. The building itself, in that brief transitional state where the night's emergencies had resolved or were being handed off and the days hadn't started yet. Nora had seen this transition hundreds of times. She walked through the parking lot and through the sliding glass doors with her bag on her shoulder and her overnight face on the one that was not tired exactly, just stripped of anything non-essential. The day-charge nurse at the station was someone she recognized: Kei Orimoto, reliable, conscientious, always slightly overwhelmed by the opening of day shifts. Kei looked up when Nora came through the doors, and her expression went through several things rapidly. "Nora, you I heard about last night. I don't know what. Dr. Fowler's still here. He's finishing handoff. And Vance?" Kei's expression settled into something more careful. "She's in her office." Nora nodded and went to find Fowler. He was at the physician workstation, and he turned when she approached, and something in his posture often did when they encountered Nora Harmon after a shift that had changed the shape of what they understood about her. It adjusted, recalibrated, tried to accommodate new information within existing frameworks. "I heard you left with military personnel last night," he said. "I did. The helicopter on the roof training accident. Classified site. 4 casualties, 3 of whom will recover. The 4th I'm waiting to hear on." She paused. "Fowler, patient you cleared last night. The head trauma. Kowalski. He's in neuro ICU. He get the CT. Yes, a beat. You were right about the epidural." She said nothing. "They caught it because the attending saw your chart note. The one you put in before Vance." He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is in the process of understanding that a situation he thought was administrative is actually something larger. "Before Vance sent you home." "I know. If they hadn't." "I know," she said again, and the way she said it closed that particular door without cruelty. "I need you to know that what happened last night, with the records, it's going to come out today. The investigation is already running. People are going to have questions." Fowler stared at her. "What investigation? What records?" "You'll be briefed. I wanted to tell you myself, because you've been fair to me when it would have been easier not to be." He was quiet for a moment. "Then how long has this been happening?" 14 months that we know of." His jaw did something complicated. He was a young attending who had been doing his best in a department with a complicated political structure, and the thing she could see on his face was the particular discomfort of realizing that doing your best had not been enough to prevent something from happening in your vicinity. "I should have paid more attention," he said. "Yes," she said, because he should have, and she wasn't going to tell him otherwise. "But that's for you to sit with. Right now I need to get to Vance's office before the board investigators get here, and I need you to not get in the way of whatever happens next." "I wouldn't," he said. She believed him. The hallway to the administrative offices smelled different from the clinical areas, a particular mix of carpet cleaner and recycled air that always made the back of Nora's neck feel slightly wrong. She had walked this hallway 3 times in her career. At Callaway Regional, always for meetings she hasn't sought and hadn't wanted. Deborah Vance's office was the 3rd door on the left. The door was closed. Nora could see light under it, which meant she was there. She knocked once. "Come in." She opened the door. Deborah was at her desk, and the first thing Nora noticed was that she was not surprised. It was interesting. The second thing she noticed was that Deborah had the particular arrangement of someone who has prepared for a difficult conversation: hands flat on the desk, posture formal, studied neutrality, of someone who has decided in advance how to present themselves. "Nora," she said. She did not offer for her to sit. Nora sat anyway. She set her bag on the floor and leaned back in the chair with the ease of someone who is not physically tired, despite having reason to be, because she had gone past tired sometime around 3 in the morning and come out the other side into the state where the body just runs. I want to tell you before anyone else does, Nora said. There's an investigation. It started last night. It involves the documentation in my file. Something moved across Deborah's face. Very controlled. Very brief. Nurses' documentation files are subject to regular audit, Deborah said. This isn't an internal audit. What is it? Naval Criminal Investigative Service, coordinating with the Oregon State Medical Board. They've already pulled the backup server. Nora looked at her steadily. Deborah, the backup server, the silence that followed, had a physical weight to it. Deborah's hands on the desk did not move. Her face did not crack. But something changed in the room the way things change when a structure that has been holding under pressure reaches the point where it is no longer holding, not visibly, not loudly, just a quality in the air. You need to contact your union representative before the investigators arrive, Nora said. I'm telling you that because it's the right thing to tell you, not because I owe you anything. I don't need Deborah. Nora leaned forward slightly. Her voice was very quiet. They have the originals. They have the changes. They have timestamps and access logs, and they can see exactly which credentials were used and when. She paused. Contact your representative. She stood. She picked up her bag. Deborah's mouth opened. Don't, Nora said, and left. The board investigators arrived at Callaway Regional at 8:47. Nora knew this because she was in the break room with a cup of actual coffee, which she'd been told was available, and which tasted like all break room coffee everywhere, adequate and slightly burnt, when Kei Orimoto came and found her and said there were 2 people at the front asking for administration. And then 2 minutes later, a third person appeared who showed credentials to the front desk that made the receptionist reach for the phone. Specialist Pruitt had come herself. Nora had not expected that. Pruitt was compact and calm, and when she found Nora in the break room, she looked at her with the expression of someone who has been doing a job for a long time and has learned to take the measure of people quickly and doesn't. Have much patience for the ones who don't meet it. Your statement was thorough, Pruitt said. Helped considerably with sequencing. What's the status on Delaney? Nora said. She had been not asking this for 4 hours. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. CT confirmed subdural. Took him to surgery at 0400. He came out at 07. A pause. Surgeon said another 2 hours, and the outcome would have been different. Nora absorbed that. She held the coffee cup with both hands and looked at the table for a moment. Okay, she said. Your transfer call was correct. I know, she said, but the knowing and the hearing it were 2 different things, and she let herself have one moment with the difference before she set it down. What happens here today? Pruitt pulled out a chair and sat. She had a folder, not the theatrical kind Deborah used, just a working folder with tabs. We've requested all documentation from the past 18 months. IT is pulling the full server access logs. The preliminary comparison already shows 63 altered records. We expect to find more. She opened the folder. We'll be interviewing department staff. Process will take several days. Ms. Vance has been placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. Told. Your own status with the hospital is a separate track. The board will make a recommendation, but that's their determination to make, not ours. Pruitt looked at her evenly. For what it's worth, and I recognize that's not the point, what we've found so far is consistent with your account. It should be, Nora said, because it's what happened. Pruitt nodded. There's one more thing, she said. 2 readmissions, Alcott and Garfield. I know about them. Their families have been notified that there may be documentation issues related to their care. They have the right to request independent review. Pruitt held her gaze. That's going to produce some noise. I know. Are you prepared for that? Nora thought about what prepared meant in this context. She thought about 3 years of shifts in this building, of watching her own chart entries, quietly rewritten into a version of herself she didn't recognize, of sitting in that break room across from Deborah Vance, with a folder on the table, and absorbing it because the alternative had felt like a game she didn't have the evidence to win. She thought about Marcus Webb's temperature rising 1/10 of a degree by 1/10 of a degree in a field compound 40 miles from here, and the way Marsh had said thank you, with the voice of someone who meant it in the irreducible way that people only mean it when they've been very close to the alternative. Yes, she said. I've been prepared for a long time. The rest of the morning moved in a way that did not feel like resolution, because resolution is a thing that takes much longer than a morning and usually looks nothing like what you expected. It looked like investigators in the hallway asking the department staff questions in low voices. It looked like Fowler standing near the nursing station, with his arms crossed, periodically looking toward administration with an expression that was working through something. It looked like Kei Orimoto managing the day shift, with one eye on the clinical floor and one eye on the unusual activity at the far end of the building, and doing both with characteristic, if slightly fraying competence. Nora was in the process of giving a second verbal statement to one of the board investigators, a careful, deliberate recounting of specific incidents, dates, patient names when her phone buzzed, finished the sentence she was on, excused herself for 30 seconds, and looked at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number, 8 words. You need to look at the Garfield file now. She stared at it. Pruitt was 10 feet away, interviewing a nurse from the day team. Nora stood up, crossed the distance, and waited for the sentence to end before she interrupted. I need your IT person, she said, right now. Pruitt read the text. Her expression didn't change much, but something sharpened in her eyes. Who sent this? Pruitt said. I don't know. Do you have any reason to believe someone inside the hospital is trying to direct this investigation? I have a reason to believe, Nora said, that whoever sent this knows something about the Garfield file that they don't want to say to an investigator directly. She looked at Pruitt, which means there's something in that file you haven't found yet. Pruitt closed her folder. Show me, she said. They went together to the records terminal, and Pruitt's IT specialist, a young man named Holloway, who had the particular intensity of someone who is extremely good at finding things in data and has recently had the opportunity to prove it, pulled the Garfield file at Pruitt's direction. The active file looked like the others, clean, professional, a specific altered language that Nora had now seen enough times to recognize the way you recognize a handwriting. Holloway pulled the backup, and then he pulled something else, a third version, time-stamped 6 months ago, that had not appeared in the initial comparison because it had been saved in a subdirectory of the backup system that required specific access credentials to reach, and those credentials were not the same ones used to alter the primary records. Nora looked at the third version. The third version was the original in Nora's hand, her clinical language, her assessment, her flag, but it also had something the first original didn't have, a comment field, added after the primary entry by a second user, a second set of credentials. Holloway read the access log. He went very still. This is a physician credential, he said. He looked up at Pruitt. The comment was added by an attending physician, under Dr. Fowler's login. The break room was quiet. Pruitt's face was very still, Nora's was not. Not because she lost control of it. She had better control of it than almost anyone in the building right now, but because what she was reading in the comment field was not what she expected, and it landed, differently than anything had landed in a long time. Comment, added 6 months ago by whoever had used Fowler's credentials, was not an alteration. It was the opposite. Original assessment by R.N. Harmon was clinically correct. Discharge decision overridden against nursing recommendation. See original flag below. Below it, in a separate attached field, was a scan of a handwritten note. The handwriting was not Nora's, and it was not Fowler's. Holloway zoomed in. It was Deborah Vance's, but it was not in Deborah's handwriting she had ever seen in an official document. This was compressed, slightly unsteady, written on what looked like a torn notepad page. And what it said was not documentation. It was a note to herself, a private accounting, the kind of thing that should never have been photographed and attached to a hospital record. She was right again. If this goes through review, it comes back to me. The flag has to disappear. Pruitt read it. She read it twice. Then she looked at Nora, and for the first time since she had arrived at Callaway Regional, something on Pruitt's professional face moved past professional into human. Someone photographed this note, Pruitt said, and attached it to the backup file under a physician's credentials 6 months ago. She looked at Holloway. I need to know who accessed that backup subdirectory. Holloway was already typing. Nora stood very still. In the corner of her eye, she could see the hallway, could see a slice of the administrative corridor, could see the closed door of the office that Deborah Vance was currently in. Holloway pulled the access log for the subdirectory. He looked at it. Then he looked at Pruitt. Then, for some reason she didn't fully understand, he looked at Nora. The Subdirectory was accessed one time, he said. 6 months ago. 8:17 in the morning. He turned the screen. Under the credentials of Deborah Vance, the room went very quiet. Loaded it herself, Pruitt said. Not a question. Holloway didn't answer because the log was already answering. Nora was trying to understand the shape of what she was seeing, and she was getting there slowly, the way you sometimes arrive at a thing that's been sitting in front of you for longer than you realized. Deborah Vance had altered 63 records, had built a case against a nurse she feared, had done it carefully, professionally, with the precision of someone who understood institutional machinery. And then, 6 months ago, at 8:17 in the morning, she had photographed her own private note, the one that proved she knew she was wrong, and buried it in a backup subdirectory under her own credentials. She was keeping an exit, Nora said quietly, in case it went too far. Pruitt looked at her. She knew what she was doing the whole time, Nora said. And she kept the evidence against herself as insurance. Some kind of insurance. She wasn't entirely sure what the insurance was for, but the structure of it was becoming clear. She never expected anyone to find that subdirectory. No, Pruitt agreed, she didn't. Holloway's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then at Pruitt. Ma'am, there's a situation in the administrative corridor. Pruitt was already moving toward the door, and Nora was a step behind her. And when they reached the hallway, what they found was the kind of scene that hospitals produce when the institutional structure has fractured and people don't know yet what shape the new structure is going to take. Staff at the edges of the corridor watching, security officer at the far end, and in the middle of it, outside the door of Deborah Vance's office, one of the board investigators holding a radio and wearing the expression of someone managing a development they had not anticipated. The door to Deborah's office was open. The office was empty. Deborah Vance was gone. The office was not just empty. It had been emptied. That was the detail that Pruitt registered first and Nora registered second. And it mattered because there was a difference between a person who stepped away from their desk and a person who had removed things from it. The surface was clear in the specific way that surfaces are clear when someone has taken time to clear them. No personal items, no phone. The desk drawer left slightly open and visibly bare. Computer monitor was on, but the screen showed the login page, which meant someone had logged out before leaving. Pruitt moved to the hallway's security camera blind spot by instinct and got on her radio without raising her voice. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at the empty chair. How long ago? She said to the board investigator, who was a man named Cahill, mid-40s, the expression of someone managing the gap between what he expected this morning to be and what it had become. 40 minutes, maybe. She was here when I passed at 9:20. Came back at 10 and he gestured. Did anyone see her leave? We're checking. Pruitt came back from the radio. Building security has her on camera in the parking structure at 9:31. She had a bag. She took her personal vehicle. She looked at Cahill. Did anyone on your team make contact with her before this? Cahill had the particular discomfort of a man who is about to say something that reflects badly on his team's sequencing decisions. We were working through the department interviews first. We planned to bring her in at 11. She knew we were here, Pruitt said. The whole building knew you were here, Nora said. It wasn't a criticism. It was just true. Callaway Regional was not a large facility, and investigators in the hallways were not a subtle development. Pruitt looked at Nora. Something passed between them that was not quite apology and not quite acknowledgement, but was somewhere in the territory of two people recognizing that a thing went wrong, and both of them have to work with it. She had a 40-minute head start, Pruitt said. That's manageable. She was on the radio again, this time given the vehicle description to someone who could do something with it. Nora looked at the empty office one more time. Then she looked away, because looking at it was not useful, and she had a strong preference for things that were. The next 2 hours had the quality of aftermath, not resolution, but the period after the peak of a crisis, where the various threads that had been moving simultaneously begin to converge into something that can be accounted for. Nora gave the rest of her formal statement to Cahill in a small conference room that smelled like dry erase markers, speaking with the same precise flatness she'd used to document patient charts for 11 years. Didn't editorialize. She gave dates, times, specific incidents, and the names of patients whose records had been altered in ways she had observed in real time but had no mechanism to challenge without the evidence that Pruitt's investigation had now produced. Cahill took notes by hand, in a way that suggested he trusted paper more than the recording device he was also running. At one point he said, "Why did you stay? If you knew something was wrong, why stay at Callaway Regional for 3 years?" She had known this question was coming, the way you know questions are coming when they're the obvious ones. She had thought about how to answer it honestly without oversharing, which was always the balance she was trying to find. Because leaving would have looked like confirmation, she said. Every note in my file said I was a problem. If I left, that file closed with that story in it. I needed to outlast it. But you didn't outlast it. It found you. Yes, she said. It found me. She said it without bitterness, which was not because she didn't feel anything, but because bitterness was not a register she allowed herself in professional settings. What she felt about 3 years of having her work systematically rewritten was something she would deal with later, in private, in whatever way it needed to be dealt with. Right now, she had a statement to finish and a file to close and several patients whose outcomes she was still waiting to hear about. Cahill looked at her for a moment, then looked back at his notebook. "One more thing," he said. "The note in the Garfield file. The handwritten one Vance photographed and uploaded. We had a handwriting specialist confirm it this morning. Hers, I assumed. Do you know why she would do that? Upload something that incriminated herself?" Nora thought about what she'd said to Pruitt in the records room. The exit. The insurance. She thought about Deborah Vance, 11 years at one hospital. A precise and careful person who had done something imprecise and careless in the wrong direction, who had built a case against a colleague out of a fear that she had never named directly, but that had shaped every decision she'd made for 14 months. She knew it was wrong, Nora said. I think she needed somewhere to put the knowing. Cahill wrote that down. At noon, the hospital administrator, a man named Douglas Farrell, who had the posture of someone perpetually braced for bad news, and was currently receiving confirmation that his posture had been appropriate, called Nora into his office. He was not alone. There was a woman from the hospital's legal counsel, a man Nora didn't recognize who turned out to be the board chair, and Dr. Fowler, who appeared to have been called in for reasons she understood when she saw the board chair's expression. Farrell looked like he had not slept and had also received information this morning that made his previous levels of not sleeping look restful. "Miss Harmon," he said. "Harmon's fine," she said. "The board has been reviewing the investigative findings as they've come in this morning." He was reading from notes, which meant he was being careful. "We have a clear picture now of what's been happening in the documentation system. Scope is..." He stopped. "It's significant. 63 records," she said, "as of this morning. 67 as of an hour ago." He set down the notes. "I owe you a direct statement. What happened in this department was a serious breach of professional and legal standards. The hospital failed to catch it, and that failure extends to this office." He looked at her with the specific discomfort of a man who is saying something he means and wishes he didn't need to. "I'm sorry." "I know you are," she said. "What are the next steps?" He blinked. He had probably expected something else in response to the apology, something more or something less, but not the direct pivot to logistics. "The immediate suspension of Ms. Vance has been formalized, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. We're cooperating fully with NCIS and the board." He glanced at the legal counsel. "All records flagged in the investigation will be reviewed for patient impact. Any patient whose care may have been affected will be contacted directly. Garfield family and the Alcott family. Already notified. Morning." He paused. "Your personnel file is being reviewed and all documentation entered by or at the direction of Ms. Vance has been flagged for reassessment." Another pause. Longer. "Your position here is not in question. My badge was taken 12 hours ago. That action is being reversed. Formally and in writing." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like you to come back." She sat with that for a moment. In the chair across from Farrell's desk, she sat with it the way she sat, with things that required more than a reflex response, which was a quality some people found difficult and some people found reassuring, and she had long since stopped calibrating to either reaction. "I'll need to see the formal reinstatement documentation," she said. "And I want the personnel file reviewed in full, not selectively. Every notation that derives from Vance's documented falsification should be removed." Agreed. "And the Kowalski case, the head trauma from last night. I want a note in my file that reflects the actual clinical situation, including the chart notation I made before I was suspended." Farrell looked at Fowler, who nodded. "Done," Farrell said. She looked at the board chair, who had not spoken. He was an older man, 70s, she estimated, with the particular quality of someone who has survived long enough in institutional settings to have seen things go wrong in many different ways, and is currently categorizing this as one of the worst ones. "I have a question for the board," she said. The chair straightened slightly. "Go ahead." "The documentation system. The access credentials. Fact, 67 records were altered over 14 months without triggering any internal audit flags." She let that sit for a moment. "That's a systemic failure. It's not just one person." The chair looked at her with something that was not quite discomfort and not quite respect, but was in the neighborhood of both. "Correct. I'd like to know what's going to change. We'll be commissioning an independent audit of the documentation protocols. Time frame?" He blinked. "Within the quarter." "Within 30 days, she said. "Given the scope, within 30 days is more appropriate." Another beat of silence. "Within 30 days, he said. She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at Fowler, who had been quiet through most of this, and who met her look with the expression of a man who is in the process of reassessing things. He thought he understood. "Thank you for the chart note," she said to him. He shook his head slightly. "It was the right thing." "Yes," she said. She turned for the door, then stopped. "Kowalski. Someone should check on him this afternoon." "I'll go myself," Fowler said. She left. Corridor outside Farrell's office was empty of investigators for the first time all morning, which meant either they'd moved to a different section of the building or something external had drawn them out. Nora found out which when she reached the nursing station, and Kei Orimoto handed her a coffee, unprompted, and said, "They found her. Vance. She was at the airport." Kei kept her voice professionally low, though the station was not particularly occupied. "She had a ticket. Portland, then connecting to somewhere. I don't know where." Security stopped her at the gate. A pause. "Apparently she had a bag and a notebook. The notebook is what they wanted. Why? I don't know." That's what I heard from Cahill when he came back through. Nora thought about the notebook. She thought about a person who had photographed her own self-incriminating note and buried it in a backup server under her own credentials. She thought about what it meant to carry a private accounting of the wrong things you'd done, not as a confession, but as a record. Private, portable record. She thought about all the things she didn't know yet, about Deborah Vance's reasons, her motivations, the specific fear or ambition or long-buried resentment that had turned her toward 14 months of falsification, instead of any of the other directions she could have turned. She didn't know because she had never understood Deborah Vance the way Deborah had seemed to understand her as a threat. And she suspected she never would fully understand it, because the interior logic of what Deborah had done lived in a place Nora couldn't access. That was fine. Understanding it was not required for any of what came next. She drank the coffee Kay had handed her. It was better than break room coffee, which meant Kay had made it herself, rather than taking it from the communal pot, which was a small kindness of the kind that accumulates meaning over time. "Thank you," Nora said. Kay nodded. She had the look of someone who has things she wants to say and is unsure which ones are appropriate. Then she said, "I always thought something was wrong with the file, with the way things were documented." She looked at the station counter. "I didn't say anything." "I know," Nora said. "I should have." "Yes," Nora said. "But that's yours to sit with, not mine to manage." Kay looked up. Something in her face acknowledged this with the specific difficulty of a person receiving something fair that doesn't feel good. Nora's phone buzzed. It was Aldrin. She stepped away from the station and answered. "Update," he said. "Webb's temperature is 35.3. Cardiac consult cleared him for standard monitoring. The rhythm has been cleaned for 6 hours." Something in Nora's chest adjusted. Not dramatically, not the movie version of relief, which arrives in waves and overwhelms. The real version, which is small and quiet, and mostly feels like a muscle you'd been holding releasing. And Delaney post-op, stable. Neuro says good recovery outlook. Some deficits, possible vision field, they think, but they're optimistic. That's, she stopped. "Yeah," Aldrin said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "Grant is already complaining about the food," Aldrin said. "Reese says is a good sign." Reese is right. "Marsh is doing the arm movements. Every hour. He told me to tell you." She looked at the floor for a moment, then looked up. "Good. Commander Bates is putting together the formal commendation documentation. He asked me to let you know it'll come through official channels, your military record, and your current employer. Farrell is going to have an interesting morning," she said. "Farrell's already having an interesting morning. Fair. She ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in her hand. The hospital moved around her, the sounds of it. The particular orchestration of a medical facility managing a day's business, which was the same sound she'd been moving through for 3 years. It sounded slightly different now, though she would have had trouble articulating exactly why. Not quieter, not louder. Just different in the way that familiar spaces sometimes sound different after the thing you'd been carrying inside them has changed. Pruitt found her in the break room at 2 in the afternoon, which was where Nora had gone because she needed to be horizontal for 10 minutes, and the break room couch, though not comfortable, was the nearest option. She was not asleep. She was simply still, which was the thing she needed to be. Pruitt knocked on the open door, which Nora appreciated. She had a notebook, Pruitt said, sitting in the chair across from the couch. Probably heard. Kay told me. What Kay didn't know, and I'm telling you because it directly involves you, is what was in it. Pruitt set a photograph on the coffee table between them. It was a scan the notebook page, photographed for evidence. She's been keeping a record for 18 months, not of the falsifications, of her reasoning. Nora sat up and looked at the scan. Deborah Vance's handwriting in the notebook was different from the compressed, unsteady note in the Garfield file. This was her regular script, neat, precise. The handwriting of a person who had been filling official documentation for a decade. And the entries were dated, and they were sequential, and they described, in careful, rational language, the specific architecture of her decision to begin altering Nora's records. The first entry, 18 months ago, was 3 sentences. Harmon was right about the Denison cardiac presentation. Tending missed it. If this becomes a review event, her record is better than anyone else's in this department, including mine. Nora read it and then read the next entry and the next, and Pruitt let her read without narrating, because Pruitt was good at her job and understood when silence was more useful than commentary. The logic of the notebook was not monstrous. That was the thing. It was not the record of someone who had set out to harm a colleague out of cruelty or malice, though the effect of what she had done was harmful. It was the record of someone who had looked at a subordinate, who was better at the clinical work than she was, who had felt the specific institutional fear of being made redundant by someone she was supposed to supervise, and had made a series of decisions that each followed logically from the one before, in the way that wrong choices sometimes do, each one defensible in isolation. Each one adding to something that had become indefensible. Final entry was 2 days ago. The investigation is going to reach here. I don't know how, but I know it. I've been watching her too long not to know that she doesn't lose things. Whatever happens, I need to be out before they find the Garfield file. Nora set the scan back on the table. She knew, she said. Not about the investigation, she'd already understood that, but about the fundamental thing underneath it. She knew the whole time that I was right. Yes, Pruitt said. And she was afraid that if I was visibly right too many times, she'd lose something. Her position, her authority. The identity she'd built at this hospital for 11 years. Pruitt looked at the notebook scan. Doesn't justify what she did. No, Nora said. Doesn't. But it's the human part of it. Yes, Nora said. The human part. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. She had spent time, in the past 3 years, trying to understand what she had done to make Deborah Vance so specifically determined to undermine her. She had run through the obvious explanations: personality conflict, professional jealousy, the general territorial dynamics of institutional hierarchies, and none of them had ever fully satisfied her, because none of them explained the scale of what had been done, the persistence of it, the careful architecture of it. Now she had the explanation, and it was both more and less than she had expected. More because it was human, and therefore more fully real than the simpler versions. Less because there was no version of this explanation that made it make sense in any way that she could use. What happens to her now? Nora said. Criminal referral to the DA's office for falsification of medical records. That's a felony in Oregon Class B, given the patient impact evidence. Pruitt was precise about it, which Nora preferred to softening. The state licensing board has already begun emergency proceedings to suspend her RN license pending the criminal outcome. Given the scope and documentation, the likelihood of permanent revocation is significant. 2 patients, Garfield and Alcott. The DA will assess whether the readmissions constitute patient endangerment under the falsification statute. The Garfield hospitalization length may be an aggravating factor. Pruitt paused. There's also the question of other staff. Whether anyone else knew or had reason to know. Anyone at Callaway? We're interviewing. Nothing definitive yet. Pruitt looked at her. Do you have reason to believe anyone else was involved? Nora thought about it honestly. She thought about the 3 years of nights, the people she'd worked alongside, the small moments of witnessed unfairness that others had observed and absorbed without comment. She thought about Kei Orimoto in the hallway, saying, I should have said something. No, she said. I think she did it alone. And I think she did it alone because she knew that involving anyone else was a liability, and she was precise about liabilities. Pruitt nodded. She picked up the scan and put it back in her folder. One more thing, she said. The anonymous text. The one that directed you to the Garfield file. You identified the sender. The number belongs to a patient care coordinator who resigned from Callaway Regional 7 months ago. A woman named Terry Solis. Pruitt looked at her. Does that name mean anything to you? Nora thought. Solis, she was here when I started. Left, I assumed she left for a better position. She left because Vance initiated a disciplinary process against her. Process was resolved in Vance's favor. Solis resigned rather than appeal. Pruitt paused. She's been watching the investigation since NCIS made initial inquiries last week. She knew about the Garfield file because she was in the department when it happened. She saw Vance at the records terminal after hours. She waited 7 months to say anything. She waited until there was someone to say it to who could do something with it. Nora absorbed that. She thought about Terry Solis, a name she remembered, as belonging to a quiet, organized woman who had done her job well, and then one day simply wasn't there anymore. And she thought about 7 months of watching from the outside, waiting for the moment when the evidence would finally be in the hands of someone with authority to act on it. Tell her it mattered, Nora said. I'll put it in the report, Pruitt said, which was not the same thing, but was the version of it that Pruitt could offer. The formal reinstatement paperwork arrived at 4:45, which was not fast enough for everything that had been lost, and was also the fastest the hospital's administrative machinery had ever produced this category of document. Nora signed it at the nursing station, which she had chosen deliberately, and which produced exactly the kind of quiet, witnessed moment that she had not sought but did not avoid. Kay initialed the counter signature. Fowler, who happened to be passing, stopped and looked at the document, and then at Nora with an expression that was not quite apology. She hadn't asked for his apology and didn't want it, but was the nearest professional equivalent. You should go home, he said. You've been up for 31 hours, she said. I'm aware. Go home. She looked at the station. At the board with its patient assignments, the monitors visible through the bay windows, the organized, productive noise of a department managing its day. She had worked in this specific room for 3 years, and she had spent a not insignificant portion of that time managing the ongoing weight of being methodically undermined in it. She picked up her bag. She was heading for the door when Cahill appeared from the direction of the administrative corridor and said her name. She stopped. One development, he said. He had the expression of someone delivering information that he's not entirely sure how to categorize. Vance, in custody, she's requesting to make a statement. That's her right. She's requesting to make it to you. Nora went still. Cahill continued. She's not being coerced. She asked specifically. Said she has something she wants you to know before the process moves forward. He looked at her carefully. You're under no obligation. I want to be clear about that. Nora considered it. She considered it for approximately 15 seconds, which was longer than she usually took for most decisions, but shorter than this one probably warranted. Where is she said. Denton Falls PD downtown. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. She thought about the notebook. She was right about the Denison cardiac presentation. Thought about 18 months of entries, each one documenting the interior logic of a person who knew what she was doing and could not stop doing it and had written it all down, as if writing it down was a way of making it survivable. All right, she said. She said it without knowing what she was going to hear, without knowing whether hearing it would do anything useful, without knowing whether what Deborah Vance needed to say was something she was capable of receiving. She said it because she had made a career of going toward the thing that other people moved away from, and this was another version of that, and she was not going to be the person who stopped doing that now. The afternoon light through the hospital's glass doors was yellow and low, the particular angle of late-day sun in a Pacific Northwest autumn that looked warmer than it was. She walked through it. The sliding doors closed behind her. And in the custody processing room at Denton Falls PD, Deborah Vance was sitting with her hands flat on the table and a stillness around her that was not calm, but was the closest thing to it she could currently manage, waiting to say the thing that she had been carrying for 14 months, and that no notebook, however meticulously kept, had been sufficient to hold. The Denton Falls Police Department's custody processing area was not designed for difficult conversations. It was designed for efficiency hard chairs, fluorescent light, a table bolted to the floor, a camera in the upper corner that recorded without caring what it recorded. Nora sat across from Deb Vance in this room and looked at the woman she had worked under for 3 years and thought, not for the first time, that people rarely looked the way you expected them to look when the thing they had built finally came down. Deborah looked smaller. Not physically, she was the same height, the same build, the same composed posture that had always been one of her visible competencies. But something inside the posture had shifted, the way a load-bearing wall looks the same from outside, until you're close enough to see the cracking at the base. A legal aid attorney sat against the wall to Deborah's left. Cahill was outside the door. Nobody had asked Nora to stay quiet or to limit what she said, but nobody had given her guidance on what to say either, which she suspected was intentional. This meeting had not been arranged by the investigation. It had been requested by Deborah and permitted as a professional courtesy, and what happened in it was not evidence and not procedure, and not anything that fit neatly into the institutional machinery currently processing Deborah Vance's future. Just 2 people in a room. Deborah looked at the table first, then she looked up. "I wanted to tell you that I knew," she said. "I needed you to know that I knew, not at the end, not when the investigation started, from the beginning." Nora said nothing. She had come here to listen, not to respond, and she was going to hold to that until she understood what she was listening to. "The first time you flagged a patient and the attending overruled you, and you turned out to be right," Deborah said. "I wrote it down, not in the hospital system, in my own notebook. Just noted it, the way you note things that matter." She paused. "You were right more than anyone else in that department, consistently, and I kept noting it, and somewhere in the noting, I started to be afraid of it." "Afraid of what?" specifically, Nora said. It was the first thing she'd said, and she said it without edge, just as a request for precision. "That you'd replace me, not deliberately. I don't think you ever thought about my position at all." That was almost worse. Deborah's jaw worked slightly. "I'd been there 11 years. I built that department structure from a rotating schedule nightmare into something that functioned. I did that. And you came in and you were just better. Part that matters. The clinical part." She stopped, and I started to think that eventually someone would notice, and something would change, and I'd be reduced in some way, and I couldn't stand it. Nora was quiet. "So I started adjusting the records. Just small things. Not to hurt patients, I told myself that. I was careful about it. Only documentation, only the framing, never the actual orders." She said it with the particular tone of someone who has been examining their own rationalizations long enough to hear them for what they are. But I knew. I knew the distinction mattered less than I was telling myself. Because framing is what gets reviewed. Framing is what follows a person. "The Garfield file," Nora said. "The Garfield file was when I knew I couldn't keep doing it the way I was doing it. Came back in, and his chart said one thing, and the truth was another. And I was sitting at that terminal at 11, at night looking at the discrepancy, and She stopped, looked at her hands. "I photographed the note. I don't know entirely why. Think I needed a record that I hadn't just invented it all. That I knew what was real, even if I'd been changing what was documented." "Kept a notebook," Nora said. 18 months. "You knew it was wrong." "Yes. No hesitation. I knew it was wrong from the first change. Kept doing it because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing." She looked up. "That's a terrible reason. I know that. I'm not asking you to understand it." "What are you asking?" Deborah was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent light hummed above them, in the way fluorescent lights hum, constant, indifferent. "I'm asking you to know that it wasn't about your competence," she said. "It was about mine, or what I thought mine was worth." She looked directly at Nora for the first time without the protective formality she had maintained for 11 years, and that Nora had maintained in return. "You were never the problem. I was afraid you'd make everyone see what I already knew." "What did you already know?" "That I'd been running on habit for years." Her voice was very quiet. "That you were the kind of nurse that I had been 20 years ago, before I stopped being in the rooms and started managing the people in the rooms." Couldn't look at that without it costing me something I didn't know how to pay. Nora sat with that for a long moment. She had come into this room without knowing what she needed to hear, and she had heard something that was not a justification and was not a full accounting and was not anything she was going to file under resolved or forgiven. Those were processes that took longer than a custody room and didn't have a defined end date. But it was true. She could hear the truth in it, the way she could hear a wrong rhythm in a chest, not because she was extraordinary, but because she had paid attention long enough to know what the real thing sounded like. "Can't give you anything," Nora said. "I want to be honest with you about that. What you did caused harm to patients, and it cost me 3 years of professional standing. And I can't hand you something that makes either of those things smaller." Deborah didn't flinch. "I know, but I appreciate that you told me." Pause. "That's more than I deserve," Deborah said. "Yes," Nora said. "It is." She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at Deborah Vance one more time. The legal aid attorney against the wall, the camera in the corner, the hard chair, and the bolted table, and the specific diminishment of a person who had spent 11 years being the authority in a room and was now waiting to find out what the next room would be. She left without anything further, because there wasn't anything further that needed to be said, and she had learned a long time ago that the exits that mean something are the quiet ones. She slept for 11 hours. This was not impressive or heroic. It was the straightforward consequence of 31 hours without sleep, following a night that had included military aircraft, 4 casualties, a pneumothorax needle decompression, a hypothermia management protocol, an institutional investigation, a formal reinstatement, and 1 conversation in a custody room that had taken less than 20 minutes and cost more than she could easily measure. She woke up at 6:40 in the morning to 3 text messages, 1 voicemail, and a physical letter that had been slid under the door of her apartment at some point during the 11 hours. Texts were from Aldrin, from Fowler, and from an unknown number that turned out to be Terry Solis. Aldrin's text was 8 words. "Webb walked the hallway this morning. Thought you'd want to know." Fowler's was longer. He had gone to check on Kowalski, the head trauma patient from the night of the suspension, and Kowalski was recovering well, and had been told, in general terms, that an advocacy note in his chart had prompted the timely specialist involvement that caught his epidural hematoma. Fowler had been careful about how he framed it. He said Nora should know. Terry Solis's text said, "I heard the investigation found the Garfield file. I'm glad. I've been holding that for 7 months, and it was heavier than I expected. I hope you're okay." Nora held the phone for a moment. Then she typed back, "Thank you for knowing when to send it." She thought about adding something else, and then didn't, because it was complete as it was. The voicemail was from Bates. He sounded like himself, direct, slightly impatient with the format of voicemail, giving information efficiently. The formal commendation packet had been submitted through official channels. It included a summary of her service record, the events of 2 nights ago, and a written account from Reese, who had not been asked, but had submitted one independently describing her clinical decisions and their outcomes in the kind of precise, technical language that people who know how to write for institutional review write when they want something to be taken seriously. Reese had written it himself. She hadn't expected that. The letter under the door was handwritten, which immediately distinguished it from everything else she'd received. The envelope had no return address. The handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the cursive of someone who had been taught it properly and still used it. She made coffee before she opened it. It was from Marcus Webb's mother. She didn't know how the woman had found her address, and she would probably think about that later, and the thinking would probably be less important than the letter itself, which was 1 page, single-sided, and which she read 3 times standing at her kitchen counter with the coffee going cold in the mug beside her. The letter described a phone call. Marcus Webb, from his hospital bed at the naval facility, had called his mother the previous afternoon. He had told her he was going to be all right. He had told her about the water and the cold and the long time in the dark before the divers reached him. And he had told her about coming back surfacing through the hypothermia and the disorientation into a medical bay, where someone was managing his temperature by increments and making decisions by fractions of degrees and staying present through all of it without leaving. He had told his mother that he hadn't been alone in the dark. That was how he'd put it. Not religious, just factual. Someone had been present with him through the part where it could have gone the other way, and that presence had mattered. His mother wrote, "I don't know if you understand what it means to a parent to know that when their child was in the place where things could have ended, someone was there who knew what to do and did it. I hope you do. I hope someone has told you that in a way that landed. My son is walking the hallway today because of you, and I needed you to know that I know that, and I am grateful in a way that a letter cannot hold. But I'm sending it anyway, because some things need to be said even when words aren't enough for them." Nora set the letter on the counter. She looked out the kitchen window at the Denton Falls morning gray, as it often was, low cloud cover, and the particular Pacific Northwest light that diffuses rather than directs. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The same view she'd had for 3 years, making the same coffee in the same kitchen. Before the same kind of shift that had for 3 years been the scaffolding of a life she'd built to be small enough to be manageable. She thought about that. About smallness as a strategy. About how she had come to Denton Falls to rest from being the person she was, and had spent 3 years in a slow administrative war that had never once required her to be a smaller person, only to accept being seen as one. She had not accepted it internally. She had accepted it tactically, the way you accept terrain that doesn't favor you, not because you agree with it, but because you work within it until the terrain changes. And the terrain had changed. Violently, suddenly, through a set of circumstances she could not have predicted and had not arranged. The terrain had changed in 48 hours, in ways that 3 years of patience and documentation and quiet, stubborn presence had not managed. She was not sure what the lesson of that was, exactly. She was suspicious of clean lessons, the kind that resolve into single sentences and travel well. Real situations didn't compress that way. What she knew was this: she had not become a different person under the pressure. She had not given Deborah Vance the version of herself that the documentation tried to construct. And when the moment came that required her to be exactly who she was, she had been there, available, undamaged by the 3 years of trying to be made smaller, and that had mattered in ways she could not have planned for. Coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. She returned to Callaway Regional 8 days later. Not because the reinstatement paperwork required 8 days it didn't, but because she needed 8 days. And she had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to recognize what she needed and to not perform readiness she didn't have. Spent those 8 days doing ordinary things, sleeping regular hours, walking routes she hadn't had energy for in months, eating meals at a table instead of in transit. She talked to Bates once by phone, to Aldrin twice by text, and to nobody else from her previous life because that life had closed and the new shape of things hadn't fully defined itself yet. On the 7th day, she got a call from Douglas Farrell's office. Not from Farrell himself, from his assistant, which meant it was a formal communication rather than a personal one. They were convening a meeting of the department leadership and the hospital board's quality committee to discuss the recommendations that had come out of the documentation audit. The independent audit that she had stipulated within 30 days had been commissioned within 10. They wanted her there. She said she'd be there. On the 8th day, she put on her work clothes, picked up her bag, the old one, canvas and olive drab, which she had stopped leaving in her locker after the night of the helicopters, and which now sat by her apartment door as a matter of habit, and drove to Callaway Regional in the early morning light. Parking lot looked the same. The sliding glass doors opened with the same pneumatic exhale. The smell of the building was the same antiseptic and old coffee and the unnamed thing underneath. Kei Orimoto was at the nursing station, which was also the same, and Kei looked up when Nora came through the doors, and her expression was not the careful, uncertain thing it had been 8 days ago. It was something simpler and more direct. "Welcome back," Kei said. "Thank you," Nora said. She went to the locker room, put her bag in her locker, and clipped her badge to her scrubs. The badge was new. They'd issued a replacement. Same photo, different print date. She looked at it for a moment, then looked away. The quality committee meeting was at 9. She had 40 minutes. She used them the way she always used the time, before a shift settled into itself, walking the department, checking the board, reading the overnight handoff notes, getting a picture of what the morning was managing. 3 active patients, 2 pending discharge, 1 admission in Bay 2 that had the chart shorthand of something that would need a watching. She read the Bay 2 chart and flagged a consideration for the incoming physician with a single annotated note that said what it needed to say in 2 sentences. Fowler found her at the station. He had a coffee, 2 coffees actually, and he held one out with the slightly uncertain posture of a man who is performing a gesture he isn't sure will land. She took it. "Thank you." "How are you?" he said. He asked it like he actually wanted to know, which distinguished it from most versions of the same question. "Working on it," she said. "You?" "Same." He looked at the Bay 2 board. Flagged the new admit. "Presentation is incomplete. Could be nothing. Could not be." Right. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when they've been thinking about something and haven't found the right time to say it. Then, I should have looked harder at what was happening in the documentation. I worked in this department. I signed charts. Some of those charts were adjacent to what she was doing. And I didn't. Fowler. He stopped. "You didn't falsify anything," she said. "What you should have done and what she did are different categories of failure." She looked at him. "Learn from it. Change how you look at documentation discrepancies. That's the useful version." He nodded. He didn't thank her for the absolution, because she hadn't offered absolution. She'd offered something more actionable, which she suspected he understood. "The board meeting," he said. "I'm going to be there." "I know. I submitted something to the quality committee. Protocol proposal. For nursing advocacy documentation, a system where flags don't disappear when they're overruled by an attending, where they stay in the record with both positions visible." He said it carefully. The way people present ideas they've put real work into and are not entirely sure will be received. Came partly from, he stopped. "Well, from the past couple of weeks." She looked at him for a moment. "It's a good idea," she said. Something in his posture loosened slightly. "I thought so. But I wanted you to know it existed before the meeting." The board meeting was in the hospital's second-floor conference room, which had the particular corporate neutrality of spaces designed to accommodate conflict without amplifying it. The board chair was there, the older man from Farrell's office, whose name she had since learned was Harlan Voss, along with Farrell, 2 other board members, the quality committee chair, and 3 department heads, including Fowler. A representative from the Oregon State Medical Board's compliance office was present as an observer. Pruitt was not there. Her work at Callaway Regional was done. The criminal proceeding was now in the DA's office and moving through its own timeline. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Nora had come prepared, which meant she had a single page of notes in her precise field handwriting and a clear sense of what she wanted to accomplish, which was different from what she wanted to say. What she wanted to say was long and complicated, and included things that had no place in a board meeting. What she wanted to accomplish was specific structural changes that would make what had happened harder to happen again. She presented the documentation audit findings as a systemic failure, not a personnel failure, not because it hadn't been a personnel failure, but because personnel could be replaced and systems couldn't, and the system that had allowed 67 record alterations to proceed without a flag was a system that would allow the next version of this to proceed as well, under different credentials and different reasoning. Voss listened. The quality committee chair asked questions that told her he had read the audit report carefully. Fowler presented his protocol proposal and answered the board's questions about implementation with a specificity that suggested he had spent real time on it. At the end of the 90 minutes, the board voted on 3 measures. The independent documentation audit would produce a full systemic report within 30 days with mandatory implementation of its findings. Fowler's advocacy documentation protocol would be piloted in the emergency department within 60 days, and the hospital would establish an external review process for any documentation discrepancy that resulted in a nursing disciplinary action handled by a committee independent of the department where the discrepancy occurred. All 3 passed. Not smoothly, the 3rd measure had a 15-minute discussion that got pointed at one moment when one of the board members questioned the cost, and the quality committee chair said something quietly precise about what the alternative cost had been, and after that the vote was unanimous. Nora walked out of the meeting into the second-floor corridor and stood at the window that overlooked the parking lot for a moment. The gray morning had not resolved into sun. It rarely did in Denton Falls in November, but the light had shifted to the particular diffuse brightness that counted for full daylight in the Pacific Northwest, and it made the parking lot look clean. She was standing there when Voss appeared beside her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You understand that what happened here was a serious institutional failure, and that I take personal responsibility for the oversight gaps." "I heard you say that in the meeting," she said. "I'm saying it again, directly." He looked at her with the steadiness of a man who has been in enough institutional settings to know the difference between the public version of an apology and the real one. You deserved better from this hospital. For 3 years. Yes, she said. I did. What would it take, he said, to make you want to stay? She looked at the parking lot. She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about clinical questions, not the answer she was expected to give, not the answer that was easy to give, but the actual answer arrived at by looking at the real data. The changes from today's meeting, she said, consistently implemented and not quietly shelved in 6 months. Agreed. A formal acknowledgement in my personnel file that the disciplinary documentation from the past 14 months was falsified, not redacted annotated, with the original entries preserved, and the falsification documented alongside them. Because someone should know it happened, and the file should tell the truth about what happened. Voss was quiet for a moment. That's an unusual request. It's an accurate one, agreed, he said again. And I want to train the overnight nurses in advanced trauma assessment, not a mandatory workshop, an ongoing program, with resources and time and genuine department support. She looked at him. The gap between what nurses know they're seeing and what they're authorized to act on is where patients get hurt. I've watched it happen in this building. I'd like to close some of that gap. Voss looked at her for a long moment. That's a significant program. Yes, she said, it is. You'd lead it? That's what I'm proposing. He put out his hand. She looked at it, then shook it, because it was the appropriate gesture. And she was not in the business of refusing appropriate gestures simply because the road to them had been longer than it should have been. 3 weeks later, the DA's office filed formal charges against Deborah Vance, 4 counts of falsification of medical records, 2 counts of patient endangerment in connection with the Garfield and Alcott readmissions. State Licensing Board, moving on its own parallel timeline, suspended her RN license on an emergency basis, pending the criminal outcome. The suspension notice was a public document, filed with the board's public registry, which meant it was findable by anyone who looked. Several people looked. The nursing community in Denton Falls was smaller than the city's size, suggested people talked. People knew people. People had their own stories about documentation and supervision and the quiet institutional machinery that determined whose version of events survived the review. Nora heard about some of these conversations secondhand, through Kay and through Fowler and through Alvarez, the corpsman from the compound who had sent her a text when the charges were filed that said simply, "Good." She did not follow the criminal proceedings closely. She followed them enough to know what was happening, which was different. The distinction mattered because one version was information and the other was the particular kind of attention that pulls energy from the work you're supposed to be doing. She had work to do. The training program she had proposed to Voss took 6 weeks to design and 3 weeks to run through the department's approval process, which was faster than she had expected and slower than she had hoped, and ultimately exactly as fast as it needed to be. She built the curriculum herself, drawing on cases she had worked, not identifying details. But the clinical logic, the decision sequences, the moments where a second piece of information changed the whole read of a situation. She built it to be honest about uncertainty, which was the part most institutional training avoided because uncertainty was uncomfortable, and comfort was what institutional training was usually optimizing for. She ran the first session on a Tuesday evening in November in the hospital's training room with 11 nurses from the overnight and evening shifts. They were tired, some of them end of shift. One more thing before going home, and she did not pretend that wasn't the case, or perform a warmth she didn't have in the direction of it. This isn't a feel-good program, she said at the start. I'm not going to tell you that if you trust your instincts, everything will work out. Instincts are only useful if they're trained, and training is only useful if it's honest about what it can and can't do. She looked at the room. We're going to talk about cases where the right call was made and why it was the right call. We're also going to talk about cases where the wrong call was made and why, and what the clinical logic looked like from inside it. She paused. You'll recognize some of these cases. That's intentional. One of the nurses, a young woman named Priya Ose, 3 years out of her program, with the watchful quality of someone who asks good questions and is not always sure they're allowed to ask them, raised her hand. Are these cases from this hospital? Some of them, Nora said. Priya looked at her. Including cases from the past year? Including those. The room was quiet. Good, Priya said. And the word landed with a weight that the rest of the room seemed to absorb rather than deflect, and the session began. The letter from Marcus Webb arrived in December. Not from his mother this time, from Webb himself, written in the slightly compressed handwriting of someone who writes less often than they read, and is aware of it. He was at a rehabilitation facility in Virginia, working on the hearing in his left ear, which had partially returned and was continuing to improve. His knee was a project. He wrote his word, project, which she appreciated for its refusal to be either dramatic or dismissive. He was going to be returned to limited duty in the spring, pending the knee. He had a question in the letter, which he acknowledged might be strange to ask. He wanted to know what it had been like for her. Not the medical part, not the technical sequence of the night at the compound. He wanted to know what it was like to be the person doing that work, in that moment, with that much at stake. She read the question several times. She thought about it for 2 days, which was longer than she usually spent on correspondence. Then she wrote back. She told him that it was not heroic, in the way people imagine heroism. It was not a surge of capability or a moment of transcendence. It was the same thing it had always been, a problem in front of her, the best information she had, and the decision that was most defensible given both. The difference between that night and a regular shift was not what she brought to it. It was the stakes attached to the outcome, and stakes were not something she could control, only something she could work within. She told him that she had been afraid. Not of failing him specifically in the middle of the work. There was no room for that kind of personalized fear. But somewhere adjacent to the work, carried alongside it, was the specific fear she'd carried for years. The careful small life she'd built in Denton Falls would not survive contact with the person she actually was. That being fully herself would cost her the thing she'd been trying to hold. She told him it had cost her exactly nothing, that what she'd tried to hide had turned out to be the only thing worth keeping. Told him to work the knee. She told him the hearing almost always comes back. She folded the letter, put it in an envelope, addressed it to the rehabilitation facility. She held it for a moment before she set it in the mail stack, not because she was uncertain about sending it, but because it was the most honest thing she had put in, writing in a long time, and honesty, when it's complete, deserves a moment of acknowledgement before it goes where it's going. In January, the Oregon DA's office accepted a plea agreement from Deborah Vance, 3 of the 4 falsification counts, both endangerment charges reduced to a single count given the non-life-threatening outcomes of both readmissions. The sentence was 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent bar from practicing as a registered nurse in the state of Oregon. State Licensing Board, running on its own timeline, added a national registry flag that would appear in any licensing check in any state. Plea was publicly filed. Nora read the filing on a Tuesday morning at the nurse's station, before the day shift found its rhythm, on her phone between checking the overnight board and pulling the 9 o'clock med cart. She read it once, put the phone in her pocket, and pulled the med cart. Kay, at the station, said nothing. But she met Nora's eyes for a moment when Nora passed, and the look between them said the thing that the situation didn't require words for. Later that morning, Priya Osei stopped her in the hallway between Bay 2 and the supply room. "I heard about the plea," she said. "Yes. How do you feel?" It was a direct question, asked directly, without the apologetic framing that usually accompanied people asking Nora how she felt about things, as if they expected to be told to mind their own business. She thought about the honest answer. "Tired," she said. "Mostly." She paused. "And something else that I don't have a clean word for. Like something that was tilted has been put back level. Not perfectly level, but enough." Priya considered this. "Is that enough?" "For now," Nora said. "Things that are real take time to resolve. Felt complete and clean, I'd trust it less." Priya nodded slowly. That tracks." "Get back to Bay 2, Nora said. "Your patient in 3 needs recheck on the fluid balance." Priya went. Nora watched her go and thought about what it meant to have trained someone well enough that they knew when to ask the question and when to go back to the patient, and both of those things mattered equally. In February, the old canvas bag moved. It had been in her locker for months, in the same corner, in the same orientation. She had not been back to the compound or to anything related to the military operation since the night it happened. Bates had called twice, once for follow-up on the commendation, and once to tell her that Webb had passed his medical review for return to limited duty ahead of the projected timeline. Both calls had been brief and professional, which was how they'd always been. On a Wednesday in February, she opened her locker before a shift and looked at the bag for a moment. Then she took it out of the locker and set it on the bench. She unzipped it. Inside, packed the way she had packed it years ago and repacked it every year since, on the specific grounds that you don't let the things you might need sit unused until the bag was organized with the logic of someone who had learned its contents, under conditions that did not permit disorganization. She went through it by memory and touch, checking the supplies, noting what needed replacing, doing the inventory the way she had done it many times before. At the bottom, wrapped in a cloth that had been replaced twice over the years, was a small folded document, not a medical document. A copy of her discharge papers from the Navy, folded small enough to fit in the bag's interior pocket. She had put it there when she left and had never taken it out, not in 3 years, not during the 3 years before that, when the bag had lived in a different city. She unfolded it and looked at it. The words were the same words they had always been. The dates were the same dates. The record they contained was the same record 8 years. The postings she'd held. The commendations that were now being added to with the new one from Bates. She had read this document enough times that she knew where every sentence was, which meant she was not reading it for information. She was reading it the way you read something that has been part of you for long enough, that you need to check, occasionally, that you are still in right relationship with it, not at war with it, not defined entirely by it, just carrying it. She folded it back up and put it in the pocket and zipped the bag and put the bag back in the locker. Not in the corner this time, at the front where it was easy to reach. She closed the locker and went to work. There is a particular kind of person that institutions spend considerable energy trying to reduce to a manageable size, not because these people are threatening in the ways that institutions defend against, but because they do the one thing that quietly challenges every structure built on the premise that position equals authority. They remain, precisely and stubbornly, themselves. They don't announce it. They don't perform it. They simply will not become smaller than they are, regardless of what the documentation says about them, regardless of what the person above them needs them to believe. Nora Harmon had spent 3 years in a building that tried to document her into a version of herself she didn't recognize, and she had survived it without becoming either hard or diminished, because the survival strategy she had always had was not armor, and was not performance, and was not the particular calculated patience of someone waiting for revenge. It was simply this: she showed up. She did the work. She told the truth, and she waited for the truth to find its level. Truth is not fast. It is not reliable on any particular timeline. It does not arrive cleanly or announce itself, or resolve in the way that stories resolve, with clear edges and satisfied endings. It moves like water slowly, persistently, finding the cracks in whatever structure has been built to redirect it, and eventually, in ways that are rarely dramatic and almost always irreversible, it gets through. She had been the truth in that building for 3 years, and the building, in the end, had had to accommodate her.